Right, hello and welcome back. It's your boy Hank Hackerson with Hank Hacks Hackers. And today in this video, we are going to go through the Nmap Advanced Port Scans. And unfortunately, this is not a free room, but no worries because TryHackMe is actually quite affordable. And if you use the link in the description below, it becomes even more affordable because you get a credit towards your membership. And this is a part of the PenTest Plus pathway on the TryHackMe, and we've already done Nmap Live Host Discovery, basic port scans, and today we're going to be doing the advanced port scans. And then that'll be it for info gathering and vulnerability scanning. And then we're going to go into attacks and exploits, which is a pretty long set of exercises. And just make sure that you subscribe, follow, share, like, all that good stuff. Turn on the notification bell so that you get notified the next time a video comes out, so that you'll tag along with us when we go down the rest of this pathway. So this room is the third in the Nmap series, part of the introduction to network security module. In the first two rooms, we did live host discovery and basic port scans. And we're now going to go into advanced port scanning. In basic port scans, we covered TCP flags and the three-way handshake. And to initiate a connection, that it requires the first packet to have the SYN flag set, and we can tell if a TCP port is open based on the response that you receive from that. And so this is something that we reviewed in the last video as well, that we're just going to kind of look at one more time to get a good idea of what we're doing. So I like visuals because I just like visuals. They're a great way to learn. And so across here, you see that it goes from 0 to 32. And so there's 32 bits, which ends up being, I want to say, 8 bytes. No, and no, it's divided by 8 because each byte is 8 bits. So 32 would end up being 4 bytes, excuse me. So 4 bytes. I'm a little bit dyslexic, just so you know. And specifically, out of all of these things that we see here, what is most applicable to what we're doing is this piece right here. And each one of these flags gets 1 bit, right? So there's the urgent flag, the acknowledge flag, the push flag, the reset flag, the synchronize flag, and the finish flag. And as we see over here, there's going to be several variations or combinations that we can run to get different types of scans, right? So advanced scanning. So the basic scanning was just turning any of those things on. So let me zoom back out here. Basic scanning would turn any of these on. So you could turn on the SYN flag or do a SYN scan, and it would just have that turned on, and it would accomplish a SYN scan for you. These types of scans down here are a different level. So it requires certain combinations of these flags right here to achieve any of these types of scans. And we're going to talk about what they actually mean in a little bit. And then what we're going to also cover is spoofing the IP address, spoofing the MAC address, doing a decoy scan, fragmented packets, and idle zombie scan. So we're going to be talking about all of these things inside of the current room that we're in right now, which is actually a pretty useful room. So you're probably not going to run across stuff like this in basic environments, but when you do penetration tests or in any kind of a CTI, CTP, I think, I mess my acronyms up all the time. But when you do a test of a network or a penetration test, typically you would end up doing kind of a variation of these things just to get past intrusion detection and network security and stuff like that. So let's talk about the TCP Null scan, fin scan, and the Xmas scan. So for this, I'm going to start our victim machine, which is going to be this little green button, and I'm going to start our attack box, which is going to open up a side-by-side view for us, and I'm going to temporarily shrink that back down just so we can kind of read through these results or instructions, excuse me. So the null scan, fin scan, and the Xmas scan, and the null scan basically sends no flags. So SN is the specific option that you're going to choose within Nmap. So lowercase s, capital N, and then the target IP address, and it doesn't send any flags. And essentially, if we get a response, it's going to be a reset acknowledge type of a response. And so it says if we expect the target server to respond with a RST packet if the port is closed. Consequently, we can use the lack of RST response to figure out the ports that are not closed, which is open or filtered. So Nmap, if you do this type of a scan, Nmap, if the port is not closed, it's going to come back with either an open or filtered or open, slash filtered kind of a response. And based on that, it's guessing, so to speak, and it's guessing to see that, these things didn't come back as closed, so they're either open or they're filtered, basically. And so this is the command that you would end up running to try to get the null scan accomplished, which is sudo nmap sn 10.10.5.155. And as soon as my attack box is up, I will definitely go ahead and run that. It's almost up, so we can shrink this one more time and just read through the rest of the instructions. So we have the fin scan, which ends up sending a fin flag, and the option for that is lowercase s, upper F. And so the target system should respond with an RST if the port is closed. We'll be able to know which ports are closed and use this knowledge to infer the ports that are open or filtered. It's worth noting some firewalls will silently drop the traffic without sending an RST scan, or RST response. So Nmap SF target, you would send a fin flag, and then the response would be RST acknowledgement, which means that the port is closed. And so if there's anything open, or at the very least, I think what it does is it shows you which ones are closed. And so based on what's closed, you deduce which is open. Or Nmap would actually do it for you. So this is kind of what it looks like, right? Sudo Nmap SF, the target, and then it shows that these are potentially either open or filtered, meaning that they're going through some kind of a firewall, right? Because they didn't come back as exactly closed. It actually shows you that there's 994 closed because it did the scan of the top 1,000 ports. If we did the entire 65,000 ports, it'll have a much higher number over here, and then it'll just give you whatever it thinks is either open or filtered through some kind of a firewall. And then you have the Xmas scan, which is lowercase s, uppercase x, and the target IP address. And so what that does is it sends 3 different flags. One of them is the fin, the other one is the push, and the other one is the urgent. So it'll send these 3 flags together, and the response will come back as such. So if these things are closed, you'll get a reset and an acknowledgement response. And so this is what it looks like: sudo nmap sx, and then it'll give you potential open or filtered ports on the IP address, on the target IP address. So in a null scan, how many flags are set to 1, meaning they're active. So this is what, again, going back to the top right here, just to review this one image, this right here, these sets of flags right here, since they have 1 bit dedicated to each one of them, if there is 0, meaning, so if urgent it's not turned on, essentially, if urgent is not turned on, it's either going to be blank or it's going to have a value of 0. But if it is turned on, it's going to have a value of 1, which means it is 1 bit, right? So that's what that whole thing means when they say if it has a value of 1 or if it doesn't have a value of 1, which is what this question is asking, right? So in a null scan, how many flags are set to 1, which means 0. In a fin scan, how many are set to 1? It would be 1, which is the fin flag. In an Xmas scan, how many are set to 1? It is the fin, push, and the reset, or is it fin, push, and urgent, excuse me. Fin, push, and urgent flags are set to 1, right? So start the VM, load the attack box, and let's scan these things. So by now, we should have the attack box up and running, and it should be available right there. And there we go. We have our attack box. We're going to open up a terminal. And so what is it asking us to do? It says once both are ready, open the terminal and use Nmap to launch a fin scan against the VM, how many ports appear to be open filtered. And in this particular case, so when they did a fin scan, let's see how many showed up. It said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 showed up. So in this particular result, there were 6 ports that showed up as open. And so if we see sudo nmap sf, and there's the 10, 10, 5, 155 is going to be our victim machine, right? 10, 10, 5, yep, there you go. And so we will see in a quick second which one actually shows up as open or filtered, or how many show up as open or filtered. And then the next one is repeat the scan, doing a null scan, and how many ports will show up as open or filtered. So the first one that we did is the fin scan, which is SF, so lowercase s, uppercase f, and that's pretty much kind of like the formatting pattern for a lot of these things. So if you do a sin scan, it would be lowercase s, uppercase s. If you do a connect TCP scan, it'll be lowercase s, uppercase t. So it's lowercase s for scan, that's what I think it is anyway. And then the uppercase is what the actual type of scan that you would be running. So in this example, for example, if it's null, lowercase s, uppercase n for null, right? Or Xmas would be lowercase s, uppercase x, right? That's kind of the formatting pattern for scans and choosing different options and stuff like that. So with that being said, let's kind of zoom back out and let's see this and see how this whole thing runs right here. So I'm gonna come right back as soon as this is done and we'll see what it does. Okay, cool, so it's back and we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there is 7 open ports available, and based on what they ran, so if we zoom back out real quick, they did a fin scan, which is right here. So they had 22, 25, 80, 110, 111, and 143. 22, 25, 80. So ours has a DNS port that's open. So the domain port, or supposedly it's open, right? So there's that. And now we're gonna run a null scan against the machine as well. So sudo nmap sn, and then the IP address, and hopefully that will be done pretty quickly, and then we'll come back to the results of that right after it's done. All right, here we go, and we got a result with 7 open ports as well, and this one has 53 the DNS, which I think is also the difference between the null scan that they did. So yeah, DNS doesn't show up in the port scan that they did over here. So not a bad little approach to running these scans. And so these were our first 3 advanced port scans. So moving on to the, I guess it's called the Maimon scan. I don't know if it's Maimon or Maimon. I'm gonna say Maimon. Uriel Maimon first described this in 1996. In this, the fin and acknowledge bits are set. The target should send a RST packet as a response. However, certain BSD-derived systems drop the packet if it's an open port, exposing the open ports. So this scan won't work on most targets encountered in modern networks. However, we included in the room to better understand port scanning and the hacking mindset. So to run this, it's going to be SM, so lowercase s, uppercase m. It'll send the fin and acknowledge packets together, and it should receive an RST to imply that the packet has been dropped, I guess. Or excuse me, the target should send an RST, meaning that it's closed. However, if it doesn't send the RST or if it drops the packet, it implies that it's open. So that's it, sudo nmap sm, and then you run the IP through it, and it'll show you what is or is not open. So how many flags are set in Maimon? The number of flags that are set are 2, because we are running the fn and the acknowledge flag. So the fin, excuse me, not fn. So fin and acknowledge flags are set. So 2 flags are going to be set, which also means that there are 2 flags that have a value of 1, right? That's basically what that means. And the next ones are going to be the TCP acknowledge window and custom scans. A TCP acknowledge scan would be SA, and it only sends an acknowledge packet. So the acknowledge flag is the only thing that has a value of 1. And in a situation, so it says use the SA option to choose the scan. As we show in the figure below, the target will respond with a RST regardless of the state of the port. This behavior happens because the TCP packet with acknowledge should be sent only in response to a received TCP packet to an acknowledged script of some data. So typically how it works is that you would it would first send the SYN, and then this guy would send SYN acknowledge, and then you would send back acknowledge. So it's kind of the last step of a TCP handshake, right? And unlike our case. So in this case, this scan won't tell us whether the target port is open in a simple setup, right? In the following example, we scanned the target machine using SA, and as expected, we couldn't learn which ports were open. And so this one right here also, I think it had kind of a similar result, right? So when you ran it, the Maimon scan could not discover any open ports on the target system. So and so that is this one, which was the SA for acknowledge. And then so the next one over, it says this kind of scan would be helpful if there was a firewall in front of the target. Consequently, based on with which ACK packets have were resulting in the responses, you will learn which ports were not blocked by the firewall. In other words, this type of scan is more suitable to discover firewall rule sets and configuration. After setting up the target VM with the firewall, we repeated the acknowledge scan. This time, we received some interesting results as seen in the console output below. We got 3 ports that aren't being blocked by the firewall. This indicates that the firewall is blocking all other ports except for these 3 ports. So unfiltered means the firewall doesn't block them, and filtered would mean that they're actually going through a firewall. They're being filtered, right? So that was the SA scan, the acknowledge scan. And now we're going to go through a window scan. So another similar scan is the TCP window scan, and it's almost the same as an acknowledge scan. However, it examines the TCP window field of the RST packets that are returned. On specific systems, this can reveal that the port is open, and you can set it with SW. As shown in the figure below, we can expect to get an RST packet reply to our uninvited acknowledged packets regardless of whether the port is open or not. So launching a TCP window scan against a Linux system with no firewall will not provide much information, as we can see right here. But if you do run it against a server behind the firewall, you should get some kind of a response saying the console output shown below, the window scan pointed that 3 ports are detected as closed. This is in contrast with the ACK scan that labeled the same 3 ports as unfiltered. So although we know that these 3 ports are not closed, we realize they responded differently because of the different types of scans, indicating that the firewall does not block them, right? And then you have custom scans. So you can basically set your own flags, right? And so you can just do the scan flags option and then do any of these, or this is technically 3 flags, excuse me. So you have RST, SYN, and FIN, right? So SYN, RST, and FIN, if you wanted to set those specifically. As shown in the figure below, if you develop your custom scan, you need to know how the different ports will behave to interpret the results in different scenarios correctly. So this is a little bit more advanced scanning technique, and you should be very familiar with the types of responses that these types of flags would elicit, so that whenever you do set them, you know exactly what type of response would bring back from the server, and then what you can take away from that, right? So in TCP window scan, how many flags are set? There's 1 flag set, and you decided to experiment with a custom TCP scan that has a reset flag. What would you add after scan flags? It would be RST, right? And then the VM received an update to its firewall rule set. A new port is now allowed by the firewall. After you make sure that you've terminated the VM from task 2, start the VM for this task. Oh, I didn't realize that there was a VM for this task. Is there one? Yes, there is. So let me terminate this thing. And let's go back to this one, start this one. And then, after you make sure that you terminate the VM from tax2, start the one for this one, launch attack box if you haven't done that. Once both are ready, open a terminal and use Nmap to run an acknowledge scan against the target. How many ports appear unfiltered? The answer is 4, but we're gonna run it anyway. And we have the port number and so on and so forth. So we're gonna do this, we're gonna do all of these exercises just to kind of get a hang of running these exercises, and so we can see what the responses are going to look like and so on and so forth. So since this particular machine is going to be behind a firewall, the acknowledge scan should actually bring back a few ports that are unfiltered, right? As well as the window scan should bring back a few ports that are unfiltered or closed, excuse me. So we're going to run it and yeah, and see how that whole thing runs. So what is the IP address? It's going to show up in 3 seconds, and there's the IP address. And so what are we doing? First, we're going to do the acknowledge scan. So it's going to be SA as the option. So it's going to be sudo nmap SA, and then we're going to run the paste, enter, and let's see what that does for us. All right, so as expected, there are 4 open ports. There's one that did not show on their scan, which is 443. It's unfiltered. The service is HTTPS, so it does kind of give us the port, the service behind the port number, but I guess it says that there's no service behind the new port number, and the hint is, oh, I see. So to actually browse to it, that's what they're applying. So because it does say HTTPS right here, so if we actually try to go to that port, which would be port 443, right? So HTTPS :// the IP address would take us to the 443. So if it was HTTP without the S at the end of it, it would take us to port 80, but we're going to port 443, and if we run it, there's nothing over here. So there is no service that is running on that port, even though right here it's a little bit confusing because it says service, and then there's actually in some kind of an acronym or a name implied that there is something there, but when you actually run it, there is nothing there. So that's what they're referring to when they say, is there any service that's running behind that, right? So now let's talk about spoofing and decoys. This is an interesting concept here. So spoofing essentially means that this is our IP address, and then this is the machine that we're trying to attack. Let's see if this is what they actually are referring to, because it seems like this is going to be the victim. Yeah, so this is, I see. Okay, so we're going to send it from our IP or from the spoofed IP, and then the machine is going to respond to the spoofed IP. And this is a way for you to avoid being detected by intrusion scanners and stuff like that. So the following figure shows the attacker launching the command nmap s spoofed IP, and then the other IP. So this is going to be the victim machine. So your IP, the spoofed IP first, and then the victim IP. Consequently, Nmap will craft all packets using the provided source IP address, which is the spoofed IP. The target machine will respond to the incoming packets, sending the replies to the spoofed IP. For this scan to work and give accurate results, the attacker needs to monitor the network traffic to analyze the replies, right? So you need to be running TCP dump or Wireshark or something like that, so you could see what the results are, because it's not gonna, most likely it's not gonna come back to the IP that you ran it from. So in brief, scanning with a spoofed IP is 3 steps. Attacker sends a packet with a spoofed source IP, and then the target machine replies to the spoofed IP, and then the attacker captures the replies to figure out the open port. So in general, you would expect to specify the network interface using E and to explicitly disable a ping scan. Therefore, instead of nmap s spoofed IP, you will need to issue nmap E net interface, which could be ETH0, for example, PN to disable a ping, and then the spoofed IP, and then the victim IP. to tell Nmap explicitly which network interface to use and not to expect to receive a ping reply. It is worth repeating that this scan will be useless if the attacker cannot monitor the network for responses. So it's not going to respond back to the interface that you're running this from. So you need to be monitoring the interface either through Wireshark or TCP dump or something similar. So when you're on the same subnet as the target machine, you would be able to spoof your MAC address as well, because MAC addresses on the RP, ARP requests can be shown, so you can spoof your MAC address so that it doesn't come back to you. And I mean, there's a lot of, apparently it's actually really easy to spoof your MAC address. So you can specify the source MAC address using spoof MAC and then the spoofed MAC. This address spoofing is only possible if the attacker and the target machine are on the same Ethernet network or the same Wi-Fi network, right? So we already established that when we were talking about ARP requests, and I think that was in the kind of like the beginner Nmap, the intro to Nmap. So, or Nmap live scanning, I think that was the room. So that's going to be the name of the video, or you can just search by the Nmap live scan tag and you'll be able to find that. So spoofing only works in a minimal number of cases where certain conditions are met. Therefore, the attacker might resort to using decoys to make it more challenging to be pinpointed. The concept is simple. Make the scan appear to be coming from many IP addresses so that the attacker's IP address would be lost among them. As we see in the figure below, the scan of the target machine will appear to be coming from 3 different sources, and consequently the replies will go the decoys as well. So, you know, source decoy 1, attacker IP decoy 2, and then the machine is going to try to send it back to the decoys as well as the attacker IP, and so it becomes a little bit hard to detect. Now, instead of just having 2 decoys, you could technically have, I don't know, 10, 100, depending on what your situation is like, right? So Nmap, decoy, and then decoy 1, me, decoy 2, so meaning I don't think you're supposed to actually say me, but I think you put your own IP in the middle, or maybe you do say me. Let's see if they do say that. You do say that. You actually do say me. So you can launch a decoy scan specifically by specifying a specific or random IP address after D, for example, the random IP, and then me, and then it appears to be coming from the IP addresses, and then me to indicate that your IP address should appear in the 3rd order. Another example command would be decoy 1, 2, RND, which would probably stand for random, and then me, and then that's your victim. 3rd and 4th IP addresses are assigned randomly, while the 5th source is going to be the attacker's IP address. In other words, each time you execute the latter command, you would expect 2 new random IP addresses to be the 3rd and 4th decoy sources. So what do you need to add to the command sudo nmap IP to make the scan appear as if it's coming from the source IP address, this? And so we're going to do S for spoof, and we're going to be sourcing our IP address here instead of your actual IP address. What do you need to add to the command to make the scan appear as if it's coming from the source IP address, this, and this, in addition to your IP address? Then we're going to do decoy. So essentially what I believe the difference between the two is that if you want to use just one spoofed IP, then you would use the S command, so capital S, keep that in mind. So notice how there is actual capitalization. There is case sensitivity when you're using different options within Nmap. And so capital S stands for spoof, and then you would just use one IP address following it. But then if you want to use multiple, you would do capital D and then the IP addresses and then me as the final command to imply that you want to be included in there somewhere, right? So there is that. And I think there's now going to be fragmented packets. So let's talk about that a little bit. So there's the firewall, which is basically software or hardware, because there is physical firewalls as well, that permit packets to pass through or they block them, right? That's basically what a firewall is. And you can put deny list, allow list, so on and so forth. And it could be either IP addresses or domain names, right? So if you don't want people to go to a certain website, you would put that in the firewall deny list, right? It functions based on The firewall rules summarized as blocking all traffic with exceptions or allowing all traffic with exceptions. For instance, you might block all traffic to your server except those coming from your web server. A traditional firewall inspects at least the IP header and the transport layer header. More sophisticated firewall would also try to examine the data carried by the transport layer. Then you have the intrusion detection system, inspects network packets for selected behavioral patterns or content signatures. It raises an alert whenever a malicious rule is met. In addition to the IP header and transport layer header, an IDS would inspect the data contents in the transport layer and check if it matches any malicious pattern. So, for example, there's malware attached to it, for example. How can you make it less likely for traditional firewall IDS to detect your Nmap activity? It is not easy to answer this. However, depending on the type of firewall IDS, you might benefit from dividing the packet into smaller packets, which comes down to fragmented packets. So dash f, lowercase f, fragments packets. Once chosen, the IP data will be divided into 8 bytes or less. Adding another f, which is either this or just putting them right next to each other, will split the data into 16 fragments instead of 8. And then for each one that you add, essentially you would add another 8 fragments. So you can change the default value by using the MTU. However, you should always choose a multiple of 8, right? So instead of doing FF, which I think that it basically caps out as 2 Fs, you could do MTU and then do, 32, right? Or 56 or something like that. So we'll just break them apart into fragments of 8. To properly understand fragmentation, we need to look at the IP header again, and it might look complicated at first, but we notice that we know most of its fields. In particular, notice the resource addressing taking the source address, taking 32 bits, which is 4 bytes on the 4th row, while the destination address is taking another 4 bytes on the 5th row. The data that we will fragment across multiple packets is highlighted in red to aid in the assembly. On the recipient side, IP uses the identification and fragment offset shown on the 2nd row of the figure below. So source address takes 32 bits, destination takes 32 bits, and then data is going to take 32 bits. And then so what you could do, obviously, so byte 0, byte 1, byte 2, byte 3, which means these are 8 bits. So you can split it, right? You can keep splitting it to go further and further and make it less and less trackable or detectable. So sudo nmap sin, so SS stands for sin, port 80 on this thing versus sudo nmap sin port 80F on that thing. As you know by now, this will use stealth TCP scan on port 80. However, in the second command, we are requesting to fragment the packets. So in the first 2 lines, we can see an ARP query and response. Nmap issued the ARP query because the target is on the same Ethernet. The second 2 lines show a TCP SYN ping and a reply. The 5th line is the beginning of the port scan, and Nmap sends a SYN packet to port 80. In this case, the IP header is 20 bytes and the TCP header is 24 bytes. Note that the minimum size of the TCP header is 20 bytes. So it actually shows you where is the size. There is something that should say the size, I want to say. I guess it doesn't. I don't think we have the full thing right here, that's why. But if you were on Wireshark, it should show that part to you. But so since they're on the same Ethernet, there's the ARP request that went and came back, and then you have the TCP request that went from port 70, or excuse me, these are the number of the packets, I think. So it went from 49.712 to this, and then 5355 responded back. And then you have the reset right here, or excuse me, let's see. It's on port 80, so this is it right here. So these are the ones that we're looking at right here, from what I understand, right? Because it said ARP query and response, Nmap issued ARP query, Second 2 lines show that's the first 2 lines. The second 2 lines show a SYN, ping, and reply. The 5th line, which is this, is the beginning of the port scan. Got it. So this is the port scan. So this is just the ping that went back and forth, and then this is the actual port scan, the 5th and 6th line. And the IP header is 20 bytes, etc. So with fragmentation, The 24 bytes of the TCP header will be divided into multiples of 8 bytes with the last fragment containing 8 bytes or less. Since 24 is divisible by 8, we got 3 IP fragments. Each has 20 bytes of IP header and 8 bytes of TCP header. We can see the 3 fragments between the 5th and 7th lines. And so 5th and 7th lines is implying what exactly? 42, oh I see, 42 fragmented, 42 fragmented. It says it right here. So it actually says fragmented IP protocol, which is, I mean, it's very powerful. Wireshark is one of the greatest tools. This is a screenshot of Wireshark. So it actually shows you that it's been fragmented, which is very useful as a security analyst, honestly. Because if it's been fragmented, you can kind of deduce that maybe somebody's trying to avoid you. So even though it didn't give you any kind of a red notification, it's still important to know that, oh, these guys are fragmenting just to try to avoid us. So note that if you add FF or FF, the fragmentation of the data will be multiples of 16. In other words, the 24 bytes of the TCP header in this case would be divided over 2 IP fragments. The first one would be 16 and the second one would be 8. On the other hand, if you prefer to increase the size of your packets to make them look innocuous, you can use the option data length and then the number, where the number specifies the number of bytes you want to append to your packets to make them a little bit, I guess, innocuous is a good word. If the TCP segment has a size of 64 and you did FF, how many IP fragments would you get? So it's basically 64 divided by 16, and that would end up being 4. So 4 times 6 is 24, 4 times 1, and da 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 da. So if you did FF, it's being split by 16 bytes, and then you have a total of 64, so that would end up giving you 4 different packets, 4 different IP fragments. And now we're going to talk about the zombie scan, which is also known as the idle scan. The idle scan or zombie scan requires an idle system connected to the network that you can communicate with. Practically, Nmap will make each probe appear as if it's coming from the zombie host, the idle host. Then it will check for indicators whether the idle zombie host received any response to the spoofed probe. This is accomplished by checking the IP identification, IP ID. In the header, you can run an idle scan using Nmap SI, the zombie IP, where the zombie IP is the address of the idle host. So the scan requires the following 3 steps. Trigger the idle host to respond so that you can record the current IP ID, and then send a SYN packet to a TCP port on the target. The packet should be spoofed, so dash capital S, to appear as if coming from the idle zombie's IP address, and then trigger the idle machine again to respond so that you can compare the new IP ID with the one that you received earlier. So this is kind of what it looks like visually. You have the attacker IP. You send the acknowledgement request and the SYN to the zombie IP. The zombie responds with the IP ID. And then from here, you can go and now send it from yours to the victim. But now you're going to spoof it with the zombie IP. And then the victim is going to respond to the actual zombie machine, so the idle machine. And in this case, it looks like basically it's a printer. It's like an industrial printer. So you can use an industrial printer's IP address as a zombie. That's pretty funny. I mean, it's useful. Like the image itself will kind of tell you a lot of what you're going to be doing. Does it even show that we're going to be using a printer? Let's see. I could just search for printer in the contents of the page and see if it shows up. Oh, it is. Okay, great. So it does show that we're going to be using a multifunction printer as our idle machine, and that, I mean, that is freaking useful, buddy. Okay, cool. So then we got this, right? So it sends the RST request to the zombie. As shown below, the TCP port is open, so the target machine responds with a SYN acknowledge to the idle host zombie. The idle host responds to the unexpected packet with the RST packet, thus incrementing its IP ID. So zombie spoof IP goes to the victim. Victim sends the SYN acknowledgement, and then this guy says reset, and then now we have the documented IP of the zombie again. In the third scenario, the target machine does not respond at all to firewall rules. This lack of response will lead to the same result as if there was a closed port. The idle host won't increase the IP ID. For the final step, the attacker sends another SYN acknowledgement to the idle host. The idle host responds with the RST, incrementing the IP ID by 1 again. The attacker needs to compare the IP ID of the RST packet received in the first step with the RST packet received in the third step. If the difference is 1, it means that the port on the target machine was closed or filtered. However, if the difference is 2, it means that the port on the target was open. It's kind of tricky. So you can, you could just rewatch the video, or you can look up the documentation on an idle or a zombie IP or zombie scan, idle scan, and it'll kind of give you a little bit more. But essentially, if the port is open, so you did the first one right here, right? So you did the first one right here. This was the first scan, or the first attempt at scanning. Then it responds with its zombie ID, zombie IP, excuse me. And then now you do the second version where you're actually trying to connect to your victim, and it'll respond with an RST if it's closed, right? But then if it actually responds with a SYN acknowledge, and then this one responds back with an RST, the IP address of this thing is going to increment twice. So it'll go up by 1 digit, I'm guessing. And then in that case, you would actually end up knowing that this whole thing is open. The port itself was open right here. The port is open. And so so this one, the port is closed, as it says right here. The attacker system sends the target machine a SYN packet spoofed as sent by the idle system, and then it responds with an RST, reset. Then we do the same thing, but the attacker system sends to the target machine as sent by the idle system, but this thing actually responds with SYN acknowledge. See that? Instead of this responding with the RST right away, it responds with a SYN acknowledge, which means there was 1 and then 2 came back. So you discovered a rarely used network printer with the IP address this, and you decide to use it as a zombie in your scan. What argument would you add to Nmap? And so it's going to be SI, I believe that's what it is, right? Yeah, SI is the command to give yourself a zombie IP. I stands for idle, right? So that's the best way to kind of remember this. If you do Nmap SI, you're using an idle IP address. And that's how you would remember that if you wanted to memorize all these things. So we're about to go to another machine. So I'm going to terminate the one that we got, start this one, and read through what we're trying to do here. So adding a reason, if you want Nmap to provide more details regarding its reasoning and conclusions, consider 2 scans below. However, the latter adds reason. So this one doesn't have reason to it. And then it came back and gave whatever number of open ports that it did. And then this one does have reason attached to it. And so now it does tell you why it's assuming these things are open. So there was a SYN acknowledgement that came back, and time to live was 64. So SYN acknowledgement came back, and it gives us the explicit reason why Nmap concluded that the system is up or a particular port is open. In the console above, we can see that it's online because Nmap received an ARP response saying that, on the other hand, we know that the SSH port is deemed to be open because it received an SYN acknowledgement packet. So there's a reason, I think right here, a host is up, it received the ARP response. That's the first thing. So it's telling you why it thinks the host is up. In this situation, we didn't get that. It just says host is up. You don't know why it is. And then for the ports, it tells you the reason why it thinks the ports are open, right? On the other hand, we know that okay, very good. For more detailed output, you can consider using V for verbose or VV for very verbose, and that gives you more information as it's running the scan. It's actually a really good practice to do this no matter what you're doing, because as it runs the scan, it gives you more and more information. And it tells you the amount of time that it thinks it's going to take for it to complete. It tells you how many hops it had to take, the fact that it had to increase its time between its scans, and so on and so forth. So verbose or very verbose is actually a really good idea to just do all the time, no matter what kind of scan you're running. no matter what options you're using, it's always good to add verbose or very verbose so that you can get as much detail as possible when the scan is finished, as well as while the scan is running. So this I actually did not use. I don't think I've ever used this, and I want to kind of start using this from now on, just so I can get into the habit of doing this. These are things that it's not going to affect your scan in any way. It's just going to give you more information, and it's always good to have more information, especially when you're doing recon or pen testing or anything like that. So get used to using reason as well as very verbose. So if very verbose does not satisfy your curiosity, you can use D for debugging details or DD for even more details. You can guarantee that using D will create an output that extends beyond a single screen, okay? So just know that it's gonna be a long one. So if you're gonna do this, if you're gonna use D, and usually verbose does the same thing. When you do VV, very verbose, it also gives you a pretty long response. And so if that's indeed the case, you always want to kind of get into the habit of outputting your scan results into a, let's say, a CSV file or an XML file, so that it's easier to navigate and you don't have to be inside your terminal to do it. So launch the attack box if you haven't done so, and start the machine, wait for it to load, then open the terminal, use Nmap and run this thing to scan what is the reason provided for the stated ports being open. So let's run it, and we're gonna kind of get into the habit of also using verbose, right? SS, F, and then the reason, and then we want 10, 10, 56, 110, and then we're gonna do VV for very verbose. And then so when I press enter, look, it starts showing you all of these things already, right? It shows you as it goes. It says, this is what I'm doing, and this is what's happening, and then discovered all of these things. This doesn't, if you ran it without VV, let me actually do it. Let me run it without VV so you could see. I'm gonna do it one more time, and I'm just gonna delete VV, and it's gonna run it, and boom. So the result is much shorter, right? And then there's no discovered notification that happens. So this is the result without VV, very short, and then we're gonna go up, and this is the result with VV. So as it discovered the ports, it put it onto the screen. It said all of these things have been discovered, and then it gave us what it normally would, which is host is up, it received the ARP response, these are the open ports that we found, these are the reasons that they're open, so on and so forth. So in my opinion, using very verbose or verbose in general is just a good practice to do. It doesn't change the result of the scan as far as what happens on the detection side. It doesn't make it, it doesn't do any extra things except just give you more information on the screen. And that's, in my opinion, it's just very useful. So that is our getting more details options for the scans for Nmap. This was advanced scanning with Nmap, and here's your little cheat sheet as we go. Let me actually zoom in this way. There we go. Maybe actually the other way might be better. So we'll do it this way so we can kind of have everything onto the screen. So the TCP, Null, Fin, Xmas, Maimon, and Acknowledge scans, Windows scans, all of these things are accordingly. So Null gives you an N, and so notice again, lowercase s and an uppercase, whatever the following letter is going to be. So Null scan, N, Fin scan, F, Xmas scan, X, Maimon, M, Acknowledge, A, Window, W. So very simple formatting. You can very easily understand that. And then you have the custom TCP, right? So you would run it, and then you just want to set your own flags. So you do scan flags, and then so this one has urgent, acknowledge, push, reset, SYN, and fin. Basically all of the flags, all the flags are set over here. Then you have the spoofed source IP, which is capital S, spoofed IP, and then your target IP. Spoofed MAC is going to be spoof MAC, and then the spoofed MAC address. Decoy scan ends up having two IPs in here at the very least. It ends up being the decoy IP as well as your IP, and then putting the target over there. And then the idle zombie which SI for idle, and then you have the zombie IP as well as the target. And so as we kind of discussed, the decoy scan could have multiple, right? So you could have 5 IPs in here, and then you could even use random, so RND, for it to choose some random IP addresses on its own. You can fragment the data into 8 bytes using F. You can fragment it into 16 bytes using FF. You can fragment it into multiple sets of 16 or 8 by using MTU, which is not in this little cheat sheet. And then you have your source port that you can dedicate as such, and then data length that append random data to achieve, to reach the given length that you want, right? So you can just you can tell it to add and this has to also be multiples of 8. So if you're gonna do, FF and the length of the thing was 24, and you want it to actually be 2 complete 16s, so you would say num would be 8. So data length 8, and then it would add 8 bytes to make the full thing 32 bytes. These are some really useful flags, or I guess they are flags technically, and expected to prompt for a reply. Null if it can provoke a response from closed ports, while Maimon, ACK, and window provoke a response from open and closed ports. So when you do stuff like this, it gives you the details of that. So no matter what you're running, and from now on I'm going to be doing this, where we're going to use reason to give us the reason why it came to the conclusions that it gave to. Verbose and very verbose will just output the data onto the screen as it's happening. D for debugging, and DD for more details for debugging. And then you can also do an output command to just make sure that it outputs all of the results for you into a separate file so that you can view it later. And if you're going to be doing a lot of scans, it's always good to also get into the habit of outputting the results of each scan into a separate file, so that you don't have to kind of scroll up the terminal. You can just go review the files that you've generated. So it is a good practice to just get used to doing these types of things. So this was our advanced room for Nmap, which is available to subscribers only. Please make sure that you go ahead and get yourself your subscription. There's a link in the description below that will give you a discount towards your subscription, and it's already affordable. It just makes it more affordable for you. And then you have the videos that we're actually launching. So if you want to just do this on your own machines, but you want the instruction, you can like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, share it, comment, all that stuff, and it brings these videos into your timeline and into your feed and into your notifications, so that way you can just follow along as we put out more videos in these paths. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It's your boy Hank Hackerson at Hank Hacks Hackers, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned from this, and I will see you in the next video. Peace, love, and chicken grease. Talk to you later.